again, welcome our viewers and listeners to the Citizens Community Forum. And once again, I'm Stephen Cummings. Very interesting topic for you this evening. And as we discuss the many issues, plaguing us here in Trinidad and Tobago, and of course, the wider region, we do touch on matters of the wider region as well. And at times, we also take an international perspective, all, connecting to what's happening in the world. Of course, Trinidad and Tobago, indeed. As I said, I'm Stephen Cummings, and welcome to the Citizens Community Forum. Our objective is always to have an engaging and interactive, as well as a civil discourse, and in so doing, help develop a culture of peace and understanding through constructive dialogue and, yes, citizens' participation. Our guests and or callers to the program are persons who express views, opinions and perspectives of their own, and sometimes may not necessarily be that of the FBN network, the Citizens Community Forum, or that of the host. And our topics are also wide-ranging. Our discussions at times may be emotionally charged, but surely we can always find common ground and learn from each other irrespective of differing views. Now, elections to the Tobago House of Assembly since the 1980s, or since 1980, have taken place every 4 to 5 years and have not been without political controversies. The Tobago House of Assembly, the THA, is described as a unicameral devolved legislative body responsible for the island of Tobago within the unitary state of Trinidad and Tobago. And the Assembly was re-established in the 1980s, and in addition to the normal local government functions, it handles many of the responsibilities of the central government, save and except its limited ability to collect taxes and impose local law or zoning regulations. Nonetheless, it remains critical to the unitary state. Simply what happens in Tobago is, in the main, is also the business of Trinidad, the Trinidad central government, until, I suppose until otherwise prescribed by law. And while the island and the THA, have been run by the People's National Movement, for most of its electoral life, voters have also shown the ability through the years to shift party loyalty, which can be seen by party divisions of the Assembly from that time. As I said, I did reference 1980 to the present. Now, at this time on the program, our focus is on the current state of the THA, and we have been hearing some rumblings, and not for the first time. We're also going to take the discussion further, and what some may say continues to be a leadership crisis at the Assembly, threatening its constitutional framework. What's our topic at this time? Our topic, another look at the THA, its executive role and function in a constitutional democracy. And on the program at this time is Mr. Martin George, no stranger to the discussion on constitutional matters, and especially the business of Tobago, where he does have, might I say, a citizen's interest in the economic life of the island, being president of the Tobago Business Chamber. Mr. George, welcome again to the Citizens Community Forum.
Yes, hi, good evening to you, and good evening to your listeners and to your viewers on Facebook and on social media.
Welcome again, and it's also a pleasure to have you. I felt the need to get you in on this one, Mr. George. I couldn't let it pass with all this happening there in Tobago. I couldn't let this one pass and not have you in on the program. For some, the answer to this question might be obvious and perhaps, even rhetorical, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Is there, in your view, Mr. George, once again, a leadership crisis at the THA?
Well, I mean, there's a crisis within the PDP party. And of course, the spillover effect is that it has the potential to disrupt the business of the THA. Thus far, the chief secretary and his executive have been attempting to carry on business as usual without allowing it to muddy the waters. But I greatly suspect we have not seen or heard the last of Mr. Watson Duke, who was appointed as the Deputy Chief Secretary, and we saw today a new Deputy Chief Secretary was elected.
Yes.
And the process for that appointment is supposed to go to the president. So we wait to see how that unfolds.
But there's a question that remains, in the minds of a lot of people, and maybe you as well, Mr. George, about the constitutionality and more specifically the legality or illegality of what may have happened on the resignation of Mr. Duke. Some are saying that, was this legal? Is it still valid? Help us through this one.
All right. Okay. So what we saw was Mr. Duke sending a letter to the Chief Secretary indicating that he has resigned. Now, I am of the view that that type of correspondence has just about as much legal effect and efficacy as if he had sent it to a neighbor or a relative and said, listen, I'm resigning as Deputy Chief Secretary. Because the Chief Secretary is not the one who appointed him. The Chief Secretary is not the one who elected him. The Chief Secretary is not the one who administered the oath of office to him. So I wonder and I question, and until there is some judicial determination of the matter, I would still wonder if that letter of resignation to Mr. Augustine is of any legal effect whatsoever.
All right, very interesting point there. And you're listening to and viewing the Citizens Community Forum. I'm Stephen Cummings. Our topic, another look at the THA, its executive role and function in a constitutional democracy. I have with me Mr. Martin George, attorney and a well-known voice on constitutional matters in Trinidad and Tobago. Mr. George, there are also questions as to whether even in the current state, of the THA, whether it is able to carry out its full legal responsibility to the people, of Trinidad and Tobago, seeing that this, there's an issue now where where people are questioning whether, as you just made the point, but some people are questioning whether, we do have a fully functioning THA as we have it today.
Right. So the thing is, when one looks at the THA Act, you recognize that in order to constitute the Executive Council, you must have a Deputy Chief Secretary.
Yes.
So in other words, we must ensure that that post is validly filled.
And not vacant,
so yes. So it's either it's validly filled by Mr. Duke if it is that the resignation was not effective, or it's going to be validly filled by Dr. Faith B. Israel when she is sworn into office by the office of the president. But you need that post to constitute or to complete the Executive Council of the THA.
All right. So again, is it a case of following the law or the letter of the law?
Well, the thing is, it's not just the letter of the law, but it's the spirit of the law. If one has regard to Section 19 of the THA Act, you would recognize that it makes provision for the presiding officer. If the presiding officer wishes to demit office by resignation, the presiding officer must send the resignation to the president.
Okay.
The precedent we have thus far, when Mr. Kelvin Charles demitted office, his resignation letter was addressed to the president. Right? You also look at the act and you recognize that even where Section 35 speaks of the procedure for the no confidence motion, it says that you can have a no confidence motion being brought in the Deputy Chief Secretary or the Chief Secretary. And if either of those motions are carried, then you have a scenario where they must, within 2 days, submit their resignation. And if they don't, the president then has the power to revoke their appointments. So in other words, it seems that all roads of power and authority in terms of these appointments lead back to the president. So therefore, I don't think respectfully that if you send a letter of resignation to the chief secretary, that has the same legal efficacy as if you send it to the person who administered your oath of office and gave you that instrument of appointment to the office of deputy chief secretary.
I see you. I see. I see the point that you are making there, Mr. George. we are definitely in troubled waters again.
Well, I consider it interesting times. I wouldn't think it's troubled waters.
Troubled waters.
It's interesting times because you see, I'll tell you, the THA Act is admittedly a flawed piece of legislation, and the way you try to correct and perfect legislation is by testing it in the courts, and then of course you'll have to make the amendments unless you do a complete overhaul. But that complete overhaul requires the cooperation and support of both sides of the aisle in Parliament, and that I'm not sure we are likely to see in the near future, because what they do, they always seem to play political football with the issue. In other words, when one party is in government, they're all gung-ho about, yes, let's make changes to the THA Act, let's bring about, the provisions which will give greater autonomy, etc., because it's a good soundbite on the political platform. Of course, the opposition generally is reluctant to go along with it because they feel that in doing so, it makes the government look good, that they would be the ones who can trumpet and say, yes, we did this for Tobago, etc. So you have this game being played between the government and the opposition. And when the roles are reversed, the positions are also reversed. So in other words, the ones who were calling for it, if they end up in opposition, all of a sudden they're not in favor of it. And we've seen it actually happen.
Indeed.
When the UNC was in power, they presented what was a very comprehensive, reform bill for Tobago, and they were championing it. The PNM, which was in opposition, refused to support it, so therefore it could not pass because you need special, parliamentary majorities for these to pass because of the Constitution, right? Then, when the roles were reversed and the PNM subsequently came to power, they presented their version of a bill for Tobago autonomy and greater, protections for Tobago, and the opposition, UNC now, they refuse to support it. And that's basically the game that has been played out over the years in terms of this issue. So I don't think we are likely to see that comprehensive reform of the THA Act in the near future. So I think we'll have to test it through the courts this way, and therefore get the the changes piecemeal as we go along. If you recall from the last THA election, where there was the stalemate of the 12 seats, and you had the 6-6.
Then we have the 6-6, yes.
Right. That was something I had mentioned, and I had said, what is going to happen in such a scenario? And it actually occurred, and there was basically the assembly was a hung assembly.
Yes.
They could not really
and
get
they had to
much
go back.
done.
Had to go back to
and then that now forced the legislative change, and it was changed to 15 seats. Now, I had proposed that the better number would be 13, because 13 is a prime number, so therefore you could never get an equality of seats on either side, but the government went with 15. So if at all 3 parties contest and you end up with 5-5-5, then you basically back to a hung situation. But I mean, of course, that's just purely speculative at this point.
All right. And you're listening to and viewing the Citizens Community Forum. I'm Stephen Cummings. Our topic, another look at the THA, its executive role and function in a constitutional democracy. My guest on the program at this time, Mr. Martin George, a well-known voice on constitutional matters in Trinidad and Tobago. And we're happy to have him on the program. Very interesting. There's this view to Mr. George that there appears to be what is developing now in the THA, and what is being played out, a new kind of politics. And there's now, what appears to be 2 oppositions within the assembly. And certainly, I don't think that the act, the THA Act, makes for 2 minority leaders going forward.
Well, I think Mr. Watson Duke today described it as a house divided
Within a
against
house.
itself.
Yeah,
You know,
within a
and
house,
yes,
yes.
yes. And I think that probably is an apt description because, I mean, I guess he would have the persons who are supporting him, and Mr. Augustine would have those who are supporting him. But it appears that in terms of the assemblymen, Mr. Augustine is quite confident that he has the greater numbers on his side because remember, he famously threw down the gauntlet to Mr. Watson Duke earlier last week when he said, "Bring your no confidence motion, I'm ready for it." And Mr. Watson Duke did not bring it. So that seems to suggest that he read the tea leaves at that point and recognized that, look, he could not only fail if he brought that motion against Mr. Augustine, but the point is it's a two-edged sword because then you could have Mr. Augustine bringing a no confidence motion against Mr. Duke in his capacity as deputy chief secretary, and if Mr. Augustine has the votes and that carried, then Mr. Duke would have had to resign in dignity. So I think when he assessed that situation, he probably felt, well, look, maybe he ought not to test the waters that way.
Okay, and I'm sure that he's also been advised on some of the legal matters as well, as he traverses this business of being an assemblyman and having resigned as deputy chief, but certainly. Do you see the current rumblings as well, Mr. George, which have having some political, party supporters, for example, swaying from one side to the next, with their base, or is it that we are going to be seeing where the party base would hold, in support of Mr. Duke? Because I did hear him, Mr. Duke, talking about. Throwing down the political challenge that Farley Augustine, he doesn't see Farley winning another election in Tobago. Where do you think that the party base would swing now? PDP or towards what we're also hearing that could be a new party on the horizon under the banner of Farley Augustine?
Well, that's the point I'm getting to. I think that this scenario has reached the point where irreparable damage has been done to this relationship between Mr. Duke and Mr. Augustine. In other words, they've crossed the Rubicon. The die has been cast. So what you have is a scenario where even if for political convenience, we see the two of them at some later stage embracing and proclaiming one love, I don't think anyone is going to be convinced about the genuineness of it. It may just be for a case of political expediency, right? With both of them hugging each other and each one holding their long knife behind their back, waiting for the moment to strike. Because of the hurt that appears to have occurred between the two of them. One gets the sense that Mr. Duke feels betrayed. He feels that maybe he was used in a sense. Mr. Augustine, I guess, would have his own feelings in terms of how he feels about Mr. Duke, in terms of how Mr. Duke attempted to basically usurp his authority. So therefore, I think the feelings of hurt and anger and resentment have run too deep for it to be repaired at this stage. So essentially, you are going to be seeing one way or the other that both of them cannot continue to survive for too long within the belly and bosom of the PDP. They cannot realistically continue within the same party.
Right, because I've also been hearing that some people are saying that the winning of an election in Tobago, Duke on his own may not have been able to pull that kind of support, that 14-1 that they actually got, without Farley Augustine being in the picture. So that you've just referenced there where Mr. Duke is feeling maybe slighted, that he may have been used, and again, the talk on the ground in Tobago is that in some quarters in Tobago is that Farley was really the person that they would have voted for. Many if you walk through Tobago, many persons will tell you that.
Well, I think that, I mean, the reality is, and I mean, this is a matter of public record. Some persons felt that Mr. Duke had his own baggage, you know, with him coming into the election. Some persons felt that he was unelectable to the office of Chief Secretary. And they felt that Farley Augustine presented a more palatable, a more likable persona and face to the office of Chief Secretary. So therefore, I think with Mr. Augustine on board, clearly now the PDP was able to present to the public an option that many mainstream persons felt more comfortable with than saying, look, okay, Mr. Duke is going to be the one who is Chief Secretary. For whatever reason. So, having done so, you know, Mr. Augustine was touted even before the election as the Chief Secretary designate.
Yes.
Right? And in fact, Mr. Watson, you made that, you know, clear publicly several times.
Yes.
Yes. So you see, so therefore, on the one hand, Mr. Augustine feels that, well, he was used in that sense. So having now achieved the office of Chief Secretary, I don't think he's willing to basically hand it over to Mr. Duke. Mr. Duke, who is actually the original founder of the party, nobody could take that away from him, you know, and I guess who may have toiled in the fields, basically, you know, in the early days to get the party up and running and going. He may feel, well, hey, as founder of the party, he has been used, and now Mr. Augustine is claiming the spoils of victory. So you see, that's why I tell you, I think the bitterness and the angst and the feelings of hurt and betrayal, I think they run too deep to be cured at this point. I mean, of course, we all, you know, have to still be optimistic, you know, and hope that, you know, there's some way that it can be transformed and that there can be a rapprochement and, you know, some sort of healing and some sort of forgiveness and, you know, these things. But realistically,
it does
not at this point appear to be the most likely scenario.
All right, and you're listening to and viewing the Citizens Community Forum. I'm Stephen Cummings. Our topic this time, another look at the THA, its executive role and function in a constitutional democracy. I have with me Mr. Martin George, attorney at law, and of course, well-known voice on constitutional matters in Trinidad and Tobago. Mr. George, we have to go for a short break in just a few minutes, but the thing is, I'm hearing a kind of dangerous, you know, language coming from Mr. Duke, and I suppose other people as well have been hearing, you know, the kinds of utterances and the grand charging and you know, the posturing. You know, this certainly can't be good for the society of Tobago, because we're hearing revelations, we're hearing allegations, and let me stress that, allegations of financial impropriety, of things he's saying that, you know, he has so much, using the Bob Marley quote, he has so much things to say, and it leaves a kind of perception in the mind of Tobagonians, and by extension, you know, Trinidad and Tobago. This certainly can't be right, you know, coming from a leader, you know, to say the least.
Well, the thing is, you see, at this point, the mudslinging has begun. You know, we haven't heard necessarily in response the slinging of the mud from Mr. Augustine's camp.
Maybe just yet. Yeah, not just yet.
Duke, well, that's it. Yes, that's the point. Yeah, right. But Mr. Duke, I guess, being the union man that he is, remember, he's a man on the ground. He loves to get down and dirty with you and
he describes himself as a you know, the Spartan, you know, leading the Spartan group.
That's right. He's a street fighter. He's a street fighter. You know, so I think he has gone basically to what he knows best and what he's good at in terms of that, and that of course is part of the union history if you look at it, because I mean he's had so many skirmishes and battles while he was at PSA, while he was at WASA, you know, so his history is that he is that type of fighter. So I mean that's his go-to modus operandi, and I guess he has gone to it early. You know, as to whether he can substantiate the allegations with concrete proof, is another question, because if there really is any truth to any of those allegations, then of course those are very, very serious matters.
Yes. And he also faces, some reaction from Farley Augustine as well, because you can't just be making statements in the public.
That's the point. So in other words, there's a question of defamation, a defamation lawsuit that could be brought if it is that you really don't have anything to substantiate this, and if these are just wild, fanciful, spurious claims that you're making.
Yes.
So I mean, the point is we have to look and see how this plays out and see how it's going to be dealt with, because one way or the other, I think Mr. Augustine will have to react, if not necessarily respond. Okay, so in other words, his reaction could be simply to instruct his attorneys to file a defamation lawsuit against Mr. Duke, because you cannot leave those scurrilous accusations unanswered,
unsupported, yes, unsupported,
and hanging over your head. Because I mean, you're talking about allegations of financial impropriety, allegations of transporting money in bags, which also was an allegation that has been made against Mr. Duke in the past.
Yes,
let's not forget that.
Yes, indeed.
Let's not forget the FCB incident, taking money from one bank to another.
And walking across the street and depositing it, yes.
That's
just
correct.
the opposite.
That's correct, So, I mean, the interesting thing about history is that, the more things change, sometimes the more they remain the same.
Yes, indeed. And this is the Citizens Community Forum. Speaking with Mr. Martin George here, our topic. Another look at the THA, its executive role and function in a constitutional democracy. What is interesting to Mr. George is that Mr. Duke has said, and he's on record as saying that that he knew what Mr. Augustine was all about, but yet there is again, people are saying that, listen, yes, you were saying that you knew what this man is about, but yet, he got his full support, for the chief secretary post. I mean, how do you balance that, knowing what Mr. Duke said that he knew of the man, but yet, gave him his support?
Well, it's like, a scenario where you have basically two gangsters, and basically each one thinking that they could outwit or outsmart the other. If you understand me, we've seen that type of scenario in the movies.
I guess, yeah, the Western movies, yes.
So,
quite common in the Western movies.
You know that this one is plotting something against you. You plotting something against that one, and it's a question of who can outsmart or outmaneuver the other, right? So I think in this scenario, what Mr. Duke is suggesting is that, look, he knew all along. So I guess we wait to see what was his move in terms of how he planned to deal with it, because there's no point knowing this if you don't plan some contingency to be able to deal with it.
All right.
So one has to wait and see what he does have up his sleeve in that regard. But that's why I tell you, I think the tensions, the acrimony, the distrust, it has crossed the Rubicon. It has really, reached what Malcolm Gladwell, the author Malcolm Gladwell, describes as the tipping point. In other words, the point of no return. And I really think that these two gentlemen have reached that point.
All right, and this is the Citizens Community Forum. I'm Stephen Cummings. We are talking the business of Tobago. Our topic, another look at the THA, its executive role and function in a constitutional democracy. I have with me Mr. Martin George. Mr. George, we'll take a short break now and come right back.
Okay, sure.
The University of the West Indies has the capacity to generate its own funding, or at least part funding. Is that what I'm getting from you?
Yes, Stephen, thank you very kindly. You have put it in a precise language. If they have been doing that, it is to a minuscule extent.
Somebody tried to ask me, so what do you want? I said, brother, let me do good. Sometimes, even as a person, you ain't sure what you want, but you're absolutely sure what you don't want. And workers are absolutely certain that this 2% that is on offer is an insult
2% over an 8-year period and tell your boy about cool it, things are hard. No. Are we living in a different Trinidad and Tobago? And that is what we have to discuss.
Discussion on health, leadership, governance, crime, education, and social justice. Every Wednesday, 8 to 9 p.m., the Citizens Community Forum. Your host, Stephen Cummings. And welcome back to the Citizens Community Forum. I'm Stephen Cummings. Our topic, taking another look at the THA, its executive role and function in a constitutional democracy. I have with me my guest at this time, Mr. Martin George, attorney at law, well-known voice on constitutional matters in Trinidad and Tobago. And of course, as I said, we are talking about the business of Tobago, well, more specifically the THA. We've been seeing and hearing and reading and watching so many, of what's been happening there, from one issue of concern to another issue. And of course, this does, affect the unitary state. Whatever happens in Tobago on the constitutional matters, obviously, does, affect the unitary state of Trinidad and Tobago. Mr. George, welcome back.
Yes, hi. Good evening to your listeners and your viewers on social media, and thank you.
Now, ironically, Her Excellency, Mr. George, Paula May Weeks, who at the ceremonial opening of the 12th Parliament, the third session, who gave a verbal scolding, I want to describe it as that, about, the conduct of MPs. She used an old quotation saying, when elephants fight, the grass gets crushed or trampled. Is this what, we continue to see, at the highest levels of our society, and we can take it even beyond the THA.
But the thing is, Stephen, the reality is that in Trinidad and Tobago we have an abysmally poor record of parliamentary behavior or conduct by our elected officials. If you recall, even going back as far as Danraj Singh, the sheriff, walking about intergovernment offices and flashing his gun at people. Yes. Remember, he ended up on a murder charge. If you understand,
that was the Sumera Singh matter. Yes, I remember.
Yes. You had a former prime minister who has been charged. In fact, he's still before the courts on certain matters.
That's after some 20 years, is it? Or close
after 20 years, still before the courts.
We have to have a discussion about,
ministers.
We have to have a discussion about the judicial system, but we leave that for another time, Mr. George.
Yes. Remember, Franklin Khan was charged. I mean, of course, he was later cleared. Eric Williams, the minister, not the father of the nation, the other Eric Williams, he was also charged.
I think there was a
he was also cleared.
Was a former energy minister. I remember in the was it the Manning administration?
Yes, I think so. Yes. Yeah. Right. So the fact of the matter is, the history has shown that. In fact, just on the weekend, David Lee, MP for Pointe-a-Pierre, was charged. So the fact of the matter is that we have had, unfortunately, a history which shows that even when persons occupy the highest office or the highest offices in the land, they are not immune from what appears to be inappropriate behavior. So we have seen it, and I mean, of course, it's not a happy scenario, and that's why I always commend programs such as this, Stephen, because I think that it's necessary at times to elevate the level of discourse in Trinidad and Tobago beyond the bacchanalia and the base course level that our politicians love to take it to. And we have to be the ones to call upon them and make sure that we hold them to a higher standard. Because if we do not do so, they will continue to drag us down into the gutter at every possible opportunity.
Well, Mr. George, I suppose, we're not the only ones, with that, responsibility, that responsibility for which, been thrust upon us. But even the president, I listened very closely to the speech of Her Excellency, and she was very detailed in her, in her speaking to both houses of parliament, not just one side of the house, but both incumbent and opposition. She said that, listen, what the population is getting, I'm just paraphrasing, what the population is getting is not what they deserve.
Yes. And I mean, the reality is that we are being shortchanged. And, I mean, we have to come to a point of some kind of political maturity where, regardless of your political stripe or persuasion, you are able to say, hey, listen, let's look for what is good for TNT and not just what is good for my political party. And when we get to that point, I think we are going to see greater levels of accountability, transparency, and democracy in TNT.
And I wanted to just, touch a bit on the role of the president in this scenario as we, go back to the core of the discussion dealing with the matters there at the THA. What does the president do in such a case, Mr. George? Does she go? Does Her Excellency just gives that official seal? Because there is, as we've discussed, there's this lingering business of legality, whether it's illegal to even appoint a new chief, deputy chief. At the THA. What does the president do in such a case? Now, I know that in many instances, the president, which occupies a ceremonial post, and acts on the advice of the prime minister and the opposition, and we hear that ever so often. What does the president do in such a case? Because clearly, you would not want to go down the road of having problems at that level.
Well, I would think that she would certainly seek some kind of legal advice on the matter, because I did see circulated on social media yesterday a letter that purported to come from Freedom Chambers.
Yes, I saw that.
But
the challenge
was addressed also to the president. So I don't think it's something that she can ignore at this stage. So I would think that she must get some kind of legal advice to guide her, because she would not want to act in vain or make an appointment that ends up being undone by the courts, ruling that it is, illegal, unconstitutional. I mean, she's going to be the one ending up with egg on her face in that regard. So she has to tread very cautiously on this matter and look at it before, she makes that appointment. So while there was the election today, all right, that does not give you the authority of the office. It's only when you are appointed to that office by the president, giving you your instrument of appointment and swearing you in, then you are clothed with the full authority of the office.
Right. And what happens if there is, a situation where the president feels, having gotten all the legal advice, that listen, this thing is not legal and I'm not going to put my seal of approval. It means that Mr. Duke remains, deputy chief, and we're right back to a situation that might be untenable, going forward. Because, as you said, the president does have that right, but let me maybe you can help us through this point. Does the president, is it that the president has to, to go through with the process?
No. The fact of the matter is,
she can delay. She can.
And indicate that, look, she needs to get some legal advice on it. And, because, listen, she needs to act carefully and judiciously in this manner rather than hastily and capriciously.
Right, and this can this has I suppose there's no time there's no time limit, but the situation would warrant that the situation, you know, that this be dealt with as
Well, of
expeditiously
course,
as possible.
I assume, apart from, I guess, you know, her offering her, you know, her sympathy to the royal family, I think this must rank second on her agenda at this point.
The moment that she's back, I'm not sure if she's back in the country just yet, or maybe she
Well,
is.
even if, whether she's back or not, she must be thinking of it all now in terms of how she's going to treat with this.
But
Because it's a hot potato that has landed on her desk, and
Yes.
you know she can't avoid it.
But we do have, in the absence of, you know, of the sitting president, we do have an acting president, you know, Christine
The
Khan,
president of the Senate.
well, president of the Senate. Does that can she take that role of signing off and giving that approval, or does that go, or does it have to go to the you know, to the sitting president, you know, the head?
No, the president of the Senate, when you're acting in the role, you are invested with the full power and authority of the office of president. However, I don't imagine that Ms. Christine Kangaloo, who is the president of the Senate, is going to take it upon herself to do that without consulting the substantive office holder, which is Ms. Paula May Weeks.
And I'll tell you why I asked that question, because, you know, there's a very thin line here. You know, when we talk about, you know, even when we look at, you know, Christine Kangaloo, obviously, you know, where she would have come from, obviously, there's a political lineage. There's a line for which some people might say, well, you know, she may not be the right person to pronounce, you know, on giving this seal of approval. But, you know, that aside, it's a very dicey situation that we are, in fact, you know, facing, you know, Mr. George, when we have you know, the politics so aligned to the business, to the real serious business of the people. And is it that you know, you would want to probably see a day where we can really you know, have you know, that division in terms of not having the politics creep in to these serious you know, matters, you know, of state, because that seems to be something that keeps happening over and over again ever since, I suppose, you know, going back to our independence.
Well, the thing is, I mean, Stephen, I always like to give high office holders the greatest of respect, and I always like to give them the benefit of the doubt. So I would start off by telling you that for myself, I would imagine that Ms. Christine Kangaloo would not allow politics to enter into any decision she has to make in this regard. And I think that she will uphold the highest traditions of the office of president and would deal with it without fear or favor or without the taint of any political bias. Okay, so I will tell you that at the start. I will also tell you that it is quite possible for persons who are in the role of acting president to carry out the functions at the highest level.
That's
if
a
you
full
recall,
function.
during
Carter, yes, right, Emmanuel Carter.
Everett Carter,
yeah,
during 1992, he was the one who signed that amnesty, right? Because the substantive office holder, President Noor Hassan Ali, was on vacation out of the country. And Everett Carter was acting as president, and he's the one who signed that amnesty, you know, in the 1990 coup. So once you are acting in the office, you are invested with the full power and authority of the office. But as I say, it's a situation here now where I am fairly certain that Ms. Kangaloo would be liaising with the substantive office holder, because President Paula May Weeks is expected to be back very soon, if you understand me.
Yes.
And you don't want the stain of a wrong decision being attached to the office
and edged into the history of the country.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Oh, interesting. But isn't it strange, you know, Mr. George, that when we have these serious constitutional matters, you know, we've seen it where, you know, our substantive persons always seem to be, well, sometimes seem to be out of the country. And
well, it happens. I mean, the point is, in this situation, no one could have predicted
certainly,
the
yes.
of the Queen. You know, I mean, of course, we knew it was inevitable, but no one knew the day or the time So I would think that it's just a circumstance that has unraveled and has played itself out, and we just have to deal with it. And as I say, I'm sure the substantive office holder, President Paul May Weeks, is going to be one way or the other involved in whatever decision is taken.
Okay, certainly, because she, I suppose, it's not only in the interest of us here in Trinidad and Tobago, and more specifically Tobago, but also throughout the region and by extension maybe the world, because when these things happen, you have other jurisdictions taking note, and then as you would know in the legal in the legal fraternity, there is this thing that's called precedent, where you can.
Yeah, of course, and on that note, Stephen, I'll tell you, in the Caribbean region, Trinidad and Tobago is the leader in terms of creating and setting legal precedents. We are by far the most litigious per capita in the Caribbean. We sue for everything. But the good thing about it is that we develop the law, we push the boundaries, we push the envelope, and as a result, the most significant legal changes, legislative changes, jurisprudence in terms of the law always comes from Trinidad and Tobago. That's a fact. So the thing is, while we may bemoan and lament the fact that, sometimes these things always end up in court. The reality is that we actually carve a pathway, and we are the trailblazers in terms of the development of the legal jurisprudence for the Caribbean. Most of the significant Privy Council cases over the last, say, 20, 30 years, they have all come from Trinidad and Tobago. You may have one or two from Jamaica. Of course, most notably Pratt and Morgan. That was a significant one.
Yes, that had to do with the hanging,
dealing with the police
capital punishment.
Jamaicans for Justice, That's another significant Privy Council decision. But by and large, most of the major developments have all come from Trinidad and Tobago. When you think of things like the Mahasabha case, the Trinity Cross case, you think of, so many others that, really have emanated and have shaped, the jurisprudence, not just for Trinidad and Tobago, but for the Caribbean region. If you think of areas like, for instance, judicial review, constitutional reform, constitutional motions, Trinidad and Tobago, we are the leaders. The leaders.
So we're making history in more ways than one, and we've made history in more ways than one, Mr. George.
Indeed we have. Yes, and we continue to do so.
But just getting back to this point, and we have just a few minutes again before we close the program. And getting back to the assembly, and we do have a bill that is in the parliament right now. This business of autonomy for Tobago is something that we've been talking about since the time of A.N.R. Robinson, way back the decades.
No, we've been talking about it since Adam was a boy, since he was in primary school.
Okay, thanks for the correction. Where does this put us now, where that particular bill is concerned? Now, I sense that we can have the politics being, played out here again. The not wanting to make it a priority at this time, seeing that we have this kind of untenable situation at the THA. Does this, in your view, put further delays? Would hamper the progression of that bill through the parliament to give Tobago, I suppose, what Tobago has been asking for so many decades?
I think all this does is that it adds more flair and drama to the political football that they play with it, all the time. So it's not going to change the result, but it's like the introduction of the VAR in football, how that creates more controversy and more argument and more debate among the supporters as to, whether the electronic technology is more accurate than the human referee on the field. That's all that this scenario does. It's not going to change the result one way or the other.
And I suppose
we are not going to see that bill being passed in this session of the Parliament. I guarantee you that.
Because one of the things that's always been whether there is that kind of maturity, political maturity for the island. That's one comment, one view. For the island to have its own, to go about its business and kind of managing its own affairs.
But Stephen,
when these things happen.
Stephen, you just need to look at what is happening now, and it really makes you wonder whether there is that political maturity there, because it's not even a year; it's just 9 months.
9 months, yes.
Just 9 months.
Yes.
And look at the big brouhaha and the bacchanalia that has ensued. So could you imagine if you were to invest Tobago with more autonomy, more power? What are we going to have? Are we going to have a situation where every Monday morning you have a bloodless coup or a palace coup and some new person popping up and saying, well, I'm the new leader today, and then by the end of the week, they are deposed and thrown out because people are plotting and scheming against them? I mean, it's absurd, and it's a poor reflection on the future of Tobago if it is that you really want this greater autonomy. Because in other words, if I can't trust you in small things, how can I trust you in bigger things?
Big things, yes. Okay. And you're listening to and viewing the Citizens Community Forum. I'm Stephen Cummings, and our topic at this time, another look at the THA, its executive role and function in a constitutional democracy. I have with me my guest, Mr. Martin George, attorney at law, as we discuss these unfolding scenarios there. Mr. George, we have to bring the curtains down on the program at this time. But before I go, I wanted to just if you can just treat with us for a moment on the signals that are being sent where investor confidence is concerned, because I do know that you do sit you have a very important role where the business of Tobago is concerned, with the Tobago Business Chamber. What do you think this has done to investor confidence?
Well, any place where you have political instability, it always creates a challenge for investor confidence. Nobody wants to be in a climate where there's political uncertainty, where there could be an uprising, where there could be a revolt, where there could be a palace coup, where there could be a sudden change of regime, because in other words, that uncertainty is never good for predictability for your business. So therefore, you want a situation where it's stable, where it's safe, where it's secure. So, I mean, of course, Tobago, thankfully, is not a nation on its own. It's part of a twin island nation. So therefore, this may hopefully end up being nothing more than a storm in a teacup. But the reality is that if you are hoping to attract international investors, such as what Mr. Duke spoke about when he went to Dubai, and then, he spoke of, trying to build a city in Roxborough and these things, the investors, when they look at what is playing out and they look at what is happening between Mr. Duke and Mr. Augustine, they are going to begin to wonder, well, hey, listen, is it that my investment is likely to be compromised? Suppose there's a change in regime suddenly, or suppose this one, breaks away and forms his own party, what is going to happen? And that's the uncertainty that no investor wants. So it's never good for any place when you have that type of instability or uncertainty. So I think that's why Mr. Augustine is trying desperately to, at least give the appearance of business as usual, trying to let things continue, but the reality is that they are on shaky ground, and it's basically a house of cards. So, you're trying to paper it together, hold it together, and manage it through this crisis. But it's the type of scenario where it could all collapse in the blink of an eye.
All right, so George, we have to leave it there at the moment, and I want to thank you for taking the time once again to be with us on the Citizens Community Forum. It's always a pleasure to have you. As I said at the start of the program, I thought it was important to have you in on this one, giving some clarity, some elucidation, kind of delving a little deeper and getting a little more as to the inner workings of the act, what the act says, the THA Act, and of course giving us some enlightenment for understanding, getting a better understanding of where we are in Trinidad and Tobago, and more specifically in the Tobago context. Thank you so much again for being part of the program.
It's always a pleasure, and a good evening to you.
Yes, Mr. Martin George there, attorney at law, well-known voice on constitutional matters in Trinidad and Tobago, and on the program, our topic, another look at the THA, its executive role and function in a constitutional democracy. Well, that's our program at this time. I'm Stephen Cummings. See you next Wednesday. It was a famous poet who once said, "They came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." Words there from famous poet Martin Niemöller, 1892 to 1984.